I'm here in the National Poetry Library, so it explains the archival element. And how's the festival so far?
Yeah, it's going well. Having a lot of fun going from different place to place and listening to lots of very different things and lots of lovely languages, of course, as well, which is always nice. Well, you know all about that with your book, right? You've got all the languages in your book as well, or your books.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many amazing poets writing in different languages. I wish I could read them all or hear them all in the original, but relying on the brilliance of translators often.
You did do some good work in Edinburgh when I saw you there, where you did read out some things in other tongues, not just in English.
Yeah, I think I might have had a go at Shetlandic. Shetlandic, Scots dialect, because the tech failed us. Had to improvise.
I was really impressed with how you took that on. Actually, I thought, wow, it's not the easiest thing, is it? Because it's very different accents, as well as the actual words and grammar, but the accent's quite specific, isn't it? And we don't hear it that often.
Yeah. I think I was relying on this idea that poetry is kind of its own language. And maybe there's a way of inhabiting a poem which is possible without knowing the exact grammar or the rules of a particular language.
How did you get into poetry and international poetry? How did that start for you?
So it was a long and slow and exciting process. Things can be slow and exciting. I've been into poetry since my teens. Came here to the National Poetry Library in early 2000s. And I began to get pulled kind of sideways into poetry that was available through translation, and captivated by these bilingual editions that we have, where the shape of the poem, is facing the original, and you can start to see how differences manifest visually, as well as through the soundscape of a poem. And then in 2017, we launched a project called the Endangered Poetry Project to gather in poems spoken and written in endangered languages from around the world. And that led to the publication of the book, which I'll talk about today. And so many conversations and adventures, really, travels into different places around the world through Zoom and in person to talk about really what's going on with poetry globally, because we're quite blinkered in the West. We have we give a primacy to the written page, and so much of the poetry around the world is not written, and there's all kinds of mysteries and kind of explosive techniques that we could all be learning from. So yeah, I'm kind of hooked now, as many people in your festival are. You get hooked on languages, and there's no going back.
No. There is definitely no going back with it. I mean, even actually in the island we're both from, the island of Great Britain, we've got some really interesting sort of linguistic communities that really heavily focus and pride themselves on their poetry. And I'm thinking in particular of the Scottish Gaelic community, where that's really the thing that they're really, really proud of in terms of their literature and sort of what they've developed from that. It's something that's quite vibrant, I feel, in that community. Have you seen that reproduced in other communities you've come across in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. I found this interesting pattern whereby it seems to be that in many cases, the fewer speakers of a language there are, the more poets there are in that language. there's one extreme example which is Livonian, the Latvian, yeah, I think it's Latvian language.
Yeah,
and they have about roughly around 20 speakers of that language, and 3 of them are poets.
wow.
Yeah, and it seems to be that in this kind of reactivation of a language, when it gets really down to a few speakers, the poets step up. The poets take on the role of being an ambassador for the language, and also a campaigner for the language, because there's something about poetry performance, I think, which can excite the younger audiences in that community. And they might not respond to being told that learning a language is good for them or good for the community or whatever, but when they see a poet captivating an audience, that's a different proposition. And I like that. I like that poetry can play that role.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with poetry, right? Because it can pull on so many strings that, with how you express, whether it's historical things, whether it's emotions, whether it's clever plays with language that just make you think and sometimes make you laugh, make you have sort of the whole gamut of emotions.
Yeah,
there's something quite clever about poetry in that way, and
yeah,
about music as well. And they can be combined quite nicely as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of linguists are taking poetry quite seriously, because Nicholas Johnson, brilliant Australian linguist, talks about how poetry can be like a cookie cutter in the dough of language, and it can cut out a shape in that language, and then that can pass on to the rest of the language system, and people can use it and begin to make their own shapes in the language. And we've seen that a lot historically. I had a conversation with someone last night about Tennyson, Alfred Tennyson in English, and his famous poem In Memoriam includes so many phrases that we use every day now, like nature is red in tooth and claw. It's an everyday expression, but Tennyson wrote it and put it in a poem, and then we can all use this as a really precise form of expression. And yes, of course, with music as well, that's always exciting. And we're seeing that in a lot of successful musicians now, spoken word elements. A really great Irish band, actually, Fontaine's DC, using Gaelic in the songs. Then the album's got a Gaelic name and spoken word as well in amongst the songs. There's a Cornish musician on the New Mercury list, Gweno, who sings in Cornish. So I think those Gaelic languages are really having a renaissance in the arts.
Yeah, it is really interesting to sort of see how that will play a part. And the Cornish language community, for sure, I mean, that's a community that I am involved in. And you often see people submit poems or produce songs. And I think it really is a bedrock cornerstone of communities, this form of expression, using language in this way. With some of the communities that we're talking about, for example, in Central and South America, communities that we're looking to celebrate at the conference in Cholula. Does this stick out in some of those more than others as also something that is more highly regarded than in maybe other surrounding areas as well?
Yeah, so what languages have you been focusing on over the last few days or today?
So the main language of Cholula is Nahuatl, which I've been learning some of in preparation to go to Mexico. But there are other languages as well, obviously, in neighboring regions. And Nahuatl being obviously one of the more spoken in terms of numbers of people. I think it's more like 1.2 million. It's quite a lot of people. And I don't even know if that incorporates just one group or everyone that associates the name Nawa, because obviously there are different variations, and I mean, you could even describe them as different Nahuatl languages, because the intelligibility isn't always there between all the groups. But have you seen that in your in your travels around the poetry world? In some parts of Latin America, some communities it's at the forefront, like with the Scottish Gaelic community. It's really at the forefront of like, this is what we do.
Yeah. I mean, I have seen examples of this. Our translator, who we're trying to get into the meeting, Zoque, has translated several Mexican languages, and we'll have a real sensitivity for the differences, and the different ways in which these communities interrelate, and the way poetry manifests in those languages as well. And we have an amazing poet. I really hope we can get into the event. Mikeas Sánchez, who's a Zoque poet. I think I've pronounced that right, Richard. Zoque
poet.
Yeah.
Even better than me, because this is
well, there's the luck of the draw. So yeah, I really hope we could explore some of this over the next little while.
When you, because obviously you've looked at other poetry around the world and sort of seen, and collected them together and put them in this wonderful anthology. What are the sort of key differences you notice around the world with how poetry is written? Are there more tendencies towards rhyming, or certain types of poetry style that people use in one place more than another, in one language over another? Have you noticed that, or does that come through in translation in the same way?
A little bit, yeah. It depends on the translator. I can see a copy of Poems from the Edge of Extinction. Diana. There's different groupings, I would say. I was quite interested to find, for example, in Afghanistan, there's these incredible short poems written in Pashto by women, and it's very dangerous for them to be seen, communicating in poetry. And these poems are very often about how terrible their husbands are, kind of not the greatest depiction of these controlling men. And I found through a different conversation with somebody else that over the border in Pakistan, there's a similar technique of these very, very short, often two-line poems that are being written there as well, but not necessarily by women. And in a lot of these places as well, particularly in the Middle East, I would say that there's lots of linking techniques. So someone will start a chain of a poem, and another poet will add to the chain, and they'll begin to improvise. And it's something that we don't do so much in, certainly I would say in Europe. Improvisation happens in art galleries often, and with the avant-garde, but many poets are scared to would be scared to get up and make a poem happen on the spot. But this is this is a part of a lot of poetry cultures, and I want to bring some of that to London and Liverpool, and really wake up the poetry communities with what we can be doing, and how we can be creating in the moment. You know, I think there's a lot of liveliness to be learned. I mean, rhyme is quite prevalent throughout the world, and in a lot of these improvised poems, rhyme is a really good memory technique. So when you pass on the chain of a poem to someone else, the rhyme is one of the hooks that allows someone else to pick it up and roll with it. But definitely not always, and there's many places in which a poem can rhyme that isn't always at the end of the line. You know, and there's some, I mean, the most famous technique for that is the Welsh, I'll try and pronounce it, the Cunganed, which has a very, very intricate rhyme scheme through the middle of the line. It's based on consonants being in certain places in certain words, and it's wonderful and intricate and incredibly musical. And poets around the world know of this, you know, this technique and want to know how it works. And only a few Welsh bards really know. So if you sit them down and offer them the right glass of ale on the right day of the year, they might tell you.
It is funny to hear that, you know, certain things that you can take as well and use as inspiration from other parts of the world and how they express themselves in poetry. I had a conversation earlier today about music, and as I said, the parallel between music and poetry often is really quite striking. The thing that was pointed out was how you can learn about history and culture through these art forms, whether it's music or poetry, and often not what's said, but sometimes what's not said is the important thing. Where have you seen things like this? Any examples that strike you where this has come up in your readings?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the West, Shakespeare is probably the most famous example. I went to see a performance of a little known play this summer, Henry VIII. And Shakespeare always took his action to different places. You know, he was commenting on the Elizabethan state in all of his plays, you know, and then the Jacobean state in all of his plays. But, you know, they would be set on a tropical island, or they'd be set back in Roman Britain, and very, very cleverly, you know, he would make his point, and some would get it and some wouldn't. But in Henry VIII, this little known play, Elizabeth I is born in the play, and for me in that moment I could see how much silence is in the rest of Shakespeare, that felt so related to his moment and to actual events in the real world. But there's a wonderful poem in Poems from the Edge of Extinction where the poet who is a Cornish poet actually writes about this very thing, and I might just read a few lines of it just because it's so relevant to what you've just asked.
Please do, yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So he writes, how then can we use our foolish fond words, beloved and enchanted words, wild words which run away with us, hold up the mirror to our thoughts, breathe on it, wipe it clean, let us begin again. Perhaps year after year, age after age, we shall find at last the true lost meaning, not in our bardic lines, but between those lines, shadowed, hinting at the essence, something of what we hope to signify. And I've forgotten that he uses the word bardic in the line there. And I just love this idea that you know, with our languages, that particularly in poetry, it's somewhere between what we're we think we're trying to say, that the true meaning actually lies. And often time is wipes the slate with poetry, so you begin to have the hidden meaning come to the surface. And I think that's maybe more important with endangered languages than major ones.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really got me going with this project, Poems from the Edge of Extinction, is remembering, you know, how many great classic books in languages that we no longer speak. Dante's, you know, Divine Comedy. You know, he didn't write it in Latin. He wrote it in a Tuscan dialect, in what he called the vulgar tongue, and it helped to popularize that language. So, you know, poetry can play a real role in making a dialect into a major language. And it might not be in the bardic lines, it might not be in English, for example, that we get our next great classic. It might be in one of these Mexican languages that, you know, you're focusing on in the festival. So many examples, you know. It's an exciting prospect, you know, to be hearing these poets and wondering, you know, are these the great poems of the future, the ones that people will read in 100 years' time?
Yeah, I mean, the what you just read now from the Cornish poem there's quite a lot in there in terms of talking about language and linguistic development and linguistic loss as well. You know, it's quite impressive to sort of hear so much in there that resonates with not just the Cornish language itself as a Celtic tongue, but also the imposition of a standardized English on the English that was formed in Cornwall, with the mixing of the Cornish language and English. And what we see, and what's often downgraded as, you know, you need to speak the standard. So when you were reading that, they were the emotions that were coming up in me, because this is the thing, right? Poetry really does. It bubbles up all these feelings, emotions, and connections that we've all followed and sort of are personal. Yeah,
absolute. That's right. It's a world that you enter into, where emotions are alive, and often tensions are played out in real time. And Anna's just mentioned there about an amazing poem in the book, which is another Gaelic one, by Girish McLaughlin, and it's called Translations. And it's another poem which really goes somewhere to talking about the silences and the gaps around language. And it's narrated by a poet who is in Ireland at a poetry event and is refusing to offer translations of his poems outside of the Gaelic original. And I can actually share with you, because we worked at the National Theatre to create a performance, if you like, of this poem with two actors, and they came to the National Poetry Library here, and they kind of acted out what was going on in this poem. So I can play it just a couple of minutes.
That'd be wonderful.
And you'll see the male actors playing out this role of the tortured poet who is refusing to read anything other than in Gaelic. He mentions a Seamus, and you can probably guess what poet is being alluded to there. Is that sharing okay?
Yeah, that's showing fine.
I don't know whether sound will come through. I hope so.
Fingers crossed.
Ní astruachán a closigh si bhanach de corda. Mé astratha, atratha is cuéilethe le hiisce éirithe an bhéirla. A dhéanach lemonade thuúlínach déan darab ma cuid filiachta.
No. Tonight there will be no translations. Sheratar no. What am I doing here anyway? Is this just the latest fashion? A fad? The bilingual reading. Poetry a scuelga. Had the world gone mad?
Anima, Irene tú tíirseach de clúsa fáilsa éirneacha. Féin sásamh an monoglat a déirleat.
It sounds lovely. I wish I had the Irish. Don't you do translations?
Iad ag stána go mór thuúlach. Mar a stána chur éon chur na curann, mí compóir de canálartha.
And how glad they are when it's all over. Glad the English poet is up next, with a few jokes to smooth over the slight hitch in the evening. And here he is, with his talk of cafe culture and Seamus. Here he is to prove to them they are witty, broad-minded and cultured, that they get the gist of this poetry thing that tops and tails the evening. Here he is now.
Agus sin misha, an siúd howla ménar. Ag gár nail ma grúma, ag stána go héadfar. Ólta íon rua ma cuid filiachta gweilga, nar higéine.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it says something really, really powerful about resisting translation, but also the limitations of resisting translation. There's a real tension for a poet there.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think particularly with languages we're looking at now, languages that if you don't know the language, you don't understand. You can't have a glossary of words in the same way as you could for a language that's a sister language of English, like Scots. You could have glossaries that would not require an exact translation, but help you to piece together the meaning. But when languages are so diverse and the grammar is so different and the reference points are also completely different, you need, well, a translation, but I would actually go beyond that and say you would need an explanation to try and even get to the bottom of some of the things going on, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's so much encoded experience in any language, particularly the poem. It's through language that we have often whole histories encoded, how people related, rituals, practice, customs. So to have the language on its own can be opaque, but with poetry that can often be its strength as well. That the space around the words can be where it becomes personal to someone who engages with it. But having said that, with Poems from the Edge, I did offer an explanation for every poem. There's 50 poems from around the world, and there's a text about the language, and about the poet, and about what's happening in the poem, and that involved a lot of conversation with poets and their translators, to at least try and get a handle on what was going on with their work, what the situation was with their language, and all those sensitivities which you must be used to, Richard, around how a speaker of a language chooses to identify in terms of, you know, whether they want to be thought of as an endangered language speaker or quite the opposite. You know, it kind of wasn't my role to say.
Yeah, I mean, different people will have different identities that they assume when it comes to, well, many things in life generally, and some things overlap and some things don't. So, you know, in terms of the terminology we use within the sort of the framework of the conference is endangered, indigenous, and vulnerable languages. There's often crossover there with those terms, and we're really just doing a copy and paste of the decade of indigenous, endangered, vulnerable languages as a sort of a project by UNESCO. In terms of how individuals feel about those terms, I think everyone's got the right to have their own terminology in the own way they think about it, and they can put their own thoughts behind why they come from the angle they come from when they discuss it in that way. I don't know if there's a right or a wrong always, and like for many things in life, very often it's huge shades of grey, but it's understanding different points of view and understanding context, understanding where things are coming from, and the source of that is really important, which I think with you giving those kinds of backgrounds for poetry and the poems that you've got in your anthology is really important, because these poems, like the communities, have got their own histories, their own cultural reference points, their own backgrounds and stories that need to be shared and told. And I'd be really interested to hear if you've got any others that stick out to you that would be really good examples of that without the explanation that you've given would almost, or could be, completely misinterpreted or not understood at all.
Yeah, that's a really good prompt. I think there's one that comes to mind by John Smeltzer. It's in the Ahtna language. It's a American Native American language, and it's in some ways it's not difficult to understand, but it's about the difficulty of being understood, and it follows on quite well from the Irish Gaelic poem we heard before. I've just heard that we're going to have translators hopefully able to join us soon. So maybe I'll read this poem and we could expand the conversation slightly.
Absolutely.
So this is the poem called The Poet. I'm beginning to write in our language, but it is difficult. Only the elders speak our words, and they are forgetting. There are not many words anyhow. They are scattered like clouds, like salmon in Stepping Creek at Tonsina River. I do not speak like an Ahtna elder, but I hear the voice of a spirit, hear it at a distance, speaking quietly to me.
Wow.
Yeah, you have this idea of the language almost disappearing, receding from view. And one of the aspects of this book I really enjoyed was speaking to poets about their landscape and about the relationship between language and the natural world. And there's an Iraqi poet in the book who speaks Assyrian, who had documented, he said, about 100 words from elders in a particular village. And these words related, a lot of them, to medicinal plants. And there was this real understanding of the world and the uses of the natural world. And he left the village for many years and went back, and so many of the elders had passed away, and he found that nobody knew the words, you know, for these particular plants. And I think that's one of the, you know, that's a useful thing we could all be doing. Of course, we could all be learning a language and connecting with the elders in our communities. But I found, you know, poets often go out of the way to do this, because language is the medium, and the happiest when they're, you know, when they're exploring and expanding their language world. But also, you know, many poets, not all of them, but many like to drift and get off the mainstream, as it were. And have these conversations and discover these hidden parts of the world. So I don't know whether that's something you found as well, Richard, that the languages, the endangered languages, if you like, you know, might be full of these useful hidden portals through to the world around us.
Yeah, I've got to say, when you were reading that poem, I actually felt like I got goosebumps, because there's something really tragic about the poem, almost kind of like a vague hope as well, of a whisper that I mean, it really does mirror a lot of sort of experiences and people I've spoken to around the world, where reclaiming indigenous language, culture, and heritage becomes a fundamental part of their raison d'etre, and there's a spiritual, or not even almost, there is a spiritual connection there between those that came before and the sense that we make of the world now. And there's almost whenever I would describe it as almost a calming of the soul when you are empowered to reclaim the linguistic knowledge and the cultural and other community awareness that came before you. You then go back and take that back and own it for yourself, but also on your own terms. So this is why I think the whisper from that poem sounds also like a vague hope of positivity as well. It's kind of, there's something there of a positive. You're almost taking this whisper and then echoing it out back into an entirely new space. And I don't know if the poet meant to do that, but that's how I took it. And
yeah, that's the true meaning of the poem, then, isn't it, for you? But yeah, I like that idea of reclamation. Time after time, you know, I've discovered poets inhabit the space that writing gives them, because it is an act of reclamation. It's reclaiming the heritage. Or I'm making a statement of who they are. The language is so intimate. There's a poem in the book which is about the Alsatian language and how it was vetoed really by the French government after the Second World War. And the poet Claude Vigier writes about how his children being told they couldn't speak in this language anymore was torturous. You know, it felt like they'd become alien to themselves. It's really vivid how he describes like the tongue as, you know, kind of as choking the throat because it tried to bite back these words they weren't allowed to speak. And I really do believe that, you know, poetry and language, you know, it lives in the body, and it means we have such a intimate relationship with it that isn't always done justice in how we're taught a language, you know, with dictionaries and grammars and that kind of thing. It's very, very deeply personal to each of us, and it's our one of our major, it is our major form of expression, and that's whatever language it is, whether it's sign language or whatever. It's how our identities manifest. Now, I'm really excited to see Zoque has joined us. Hey, Zoque. Hello.
Oh,
Hey there, guys. How's it going?
Yeah, good. We're really pleased to see you. We've been talking about poems from the Edge of Extinction for a little while, and we've shared some poems from the book, and we have people with us as well in this space. Due to a complication, Mikeas isn't going to join us, but we're really delighted to have you, Zoque, as one of Mikeas's translators. And I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about Mikeas's work and your involvement and your translations. That'd be wonderful.
Yes, certainly. I'm happy to. And I've also touched base with Mikeas in case she is able to join us, as well as with Wendy Call, my co-translator of Mikeas' work. I first encountered Mikeas' work in Zoque, and I don't know how much you guys have talked about Mikeas. She's a remarkable poet who belongs to the generation of indigenous Mexican writers who really began publishing in the early 2000s. I think she was born in 1980, and she grew up in a very small village in Chiapas, where Zoque was her first language. Of course, you know, in Mexico, most children begin the process of Hispanicization at, you know, right when they begin primary school. And she began writing her early poetry in Spanish because that had been the language of her education. And then, you know, as a very conscious act, began returning to Zoque, which she still spoke, and later went on to kind of rework her earlier poems into new versions in Zoque, rather than just translating them directly from Spanish to Zoque. And in addition to her work as a poet, she's also the director of an indigenous radio station in Chiapas that broadcasts in 2 and sometimes 3 different languages of the region. Zoque, for those of you who don't know, is a branch. It's a language in the branch of the Mije Zoquian languages, spoken by about 70,000 people in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Tabasco. In terms of, you know, kind of factoids, it's a verb, subject, object language. It doesn't have tone. It's characterized by very long words with affixes and clitics, and it is considered quite endangered. I think for Mikeas, her act of writing in Zoque is a big part of her work as a language preservationist, although she's also been much more involved with more direct grassroots activism to do with language, but also to do with the environmental degradation of the area right around her home village. And today, you know, unlike many writers who are forced to go to bigger cities to make their livings, she is able to reside in her village and has a great little family and even a little shop that sells handicrafts and herbal medicines. So yeah, she's really, I first heard of her actually through my work with the Isthmus Zapotec poet Victor Terán. And I actually heard of her at, of all places, in Grasmere, when Victor and I did a reading at the Wordsworth Trust in 2010, and we were sitting on a bench right outside the house, just kind of marveling at, he was marveling at where he'd come. And, you know, comes from a land with no daffodils, but he'd read about them, and it was pretty spectacular to feel, he was now some part of that greater international literary legacy. But we got the idea, because we had been so well received, of putting together an anthology featuring a number of poets writing in distinct indigenous languages of Mexico. And one of the first people Victor suggested, when I asked him who we should include, he said, there's this young poet, Mikeas, and I think she's already wonderful, and she's going to become even, an even greater presence in our literatures. And so I started translating her, I guess, about that time, like 2010, 2011. And we started publishing poems, and Victor and I were working towards that anthology I mentioned, which came out in 2015. It's called Like a New Sun. Actually, I have it right here. And I would certainly never ever claim to speak Zoque myself. Fortunately, my background in linguistics gives me a kind of head start in understanding how a language works on the page in this instance. And then I work very closely with Mikeas. Wendy Call, who is my co-translator of the volume of Wendy's poem, of Mikeas poems forthcoming from Milkweed, which is called How to Be a Good Savage. She and I have worked extensively with Mikeas herself, basically going, sorry about that, basically going over, line by line, breaking down the structure of the sentence and asking Mikeas, to unpack all of the cultural references. And Mikeas' later work too, I think, is more engaged in some ways with the oral tradition and with the, what I'd call, traditional Zoque cosmology. And so there are, tons of names and place names and things that, are almost impossible to research, even in scholarly literature. A lot of them won't appear. But I think that collaborative process, both with a co-translator, but particularly with Mikeas herself, is really, I think, central to what we're doing, and then central to at least in my own practice as a literary translator, that relational component, the community working together, is what's most exciting and what I think ultimately makes our collaborations succeed.
Yeah. So we've talked, Shucks just give a brilliant introduction to the work of Mikeas and a bit of a grounding in the language and how the translations originally came about, as well as some of elements of Mikeas' work. We've talked in this group for about an hour now, and we've covered a lot of ground, from poems from the Edge of Extinction, poems in Gaelic, and beyond. So we've been at least halfway around the world.